Over the past 2 years, I have had several issues with fabric bleed, more so in the past 2 years than I have during my entire quilting life, which has been probably 30 years or more. I have washed quilts that have bled. I have done tests for color fastness on fabrics, only to find them bleed. And I've also experienced fabric bleed when I have been pre-starching my fabrics. Because I've been experiencing so much color bleed, I decided to try to find some additional information on the internet regarding this issue. Of course, there's a lot of information on the internet, and sometimes it's hard to figure out what's accurate and what is just conjecture. So I really tried to find some evidence-based articles based on academic research. I tried to look for more articles written by academic facilities. I did look at some videos and read accounts from quilters' experience that they've had, and of course I used my own experience. It was difficult to find any academic articles or evidence-based articles. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know if I wasn't looking in the right place, but I only found one article. Hello everyone, I'm Michelle Fox and welcome to The Simple Quilter. In today's video, I'm going to give you some basic information about color bleed. I'm going to leave some resources in case you want to look into color bleed a little bit more. And I'm going to share the reflection of my own experience with fabric in which the color has bled. And I'll leave some takeaway tips for you to consider when dealing with fabric bleed or the prevention of fabric bleed. Fabric bleed occurs when a fabric is exposed to a liquid or water. And once it's been exposed, the pigments in the dye begin to move. Now those pigments can move on to other fabrics, they can move on to different surfaces, they can even bleed onto a person's skin. Years and years ago when I was much younger, I recall having on a pair of tight, new, dark blue jeans. And for some reason, I think my jeans got soaked. We may have been caught in a rainstorm or something, but when I peeled, and they were tight, I was pretty much peeling the wet jeans off. When I peeled them down, my legs were blue. That's an example of fabric bleeding or color migration from a fabric. Textile manufacturers use a variety of strategies to try to limit color bleed or color migration. They perform rigorous tests, they utilize quality control measures, they may use dye fixing agents, they may use a treatment prior to dyeing and after dyeing or post treatments for dyed fabric to try to improve the color fastness of different fabrics. Because as fabric manufacturers, they don't want their fabrics to bleed. During the manufacturing process, there are several factors that can cause bleeding of dyed fabric. Those may include poor dye fixation. Perhaps once the fabric was dyed, it wasn't rinsed well enough, so there might be extra dye within the fabric. There might have been a poor ratio of fabric to dye when the fabric was dyed. They could have used poor quality dyes, or they may have just had a poor dyeing process, or they may have just used improper dyeing techniques. Once we have the fabric in our possession, there are other factors that can cause or contribute to additional fabric bleeding. These may include the temperature of the fabric in which we wash our fabrics or our quilts, the amount of exposure or excessive exposure to liquid. For example, if your basement floods and you had some quilts in there, that excessive exposure to liquid might cause the fabrics in those quilts to bleed. pH of the water, like in the cities where we live, could contribute to that, as well as the hardness of the water. The chemicals we use to wash and clean our quilts and fabrics could also contribute to that. The chemicals I'm referring to would be the different soaps that we could use. I corresponded with a quilter, and she was telling me that she had a house in Lubbock and one in Dallas. At her home in Lubbock, she had fabrics that ran, but in her home in Dallas, she had less of an issue. And that could have been contributed to the hardness and pH of the water in those separate areas. Now, there's several products available to help control or prevent fabric bleed. Some of the common ones we use are the color catchers. Those are the dry sheets that you put in with your wash and they catch the color. There's Synthrapol, there's Retayne, as well as special quilt soaps that are supposed to be more gentle for washing our treasured quilts. There may be more that I haven't mentioned. Those are the four most common ones. Those are the ones that I'm familiar with. I read a thought-provoking article by Vicki Welsh, and she hand dyes her fabrics, and she talks a little bit about the experience she's had with dyeing fabrics and color bleed, and she talks a little bit about the different products that you can use. Now, it is thought-provoking. I will leave a link in the description below so you can read the article and then decide for yourself, if you want to implement any of those ideas or not when you're trying to prevent or fix color bleed. It is an interesting article and definitely thought-provoking. Next, I want to share a reflection of my experiences with some color bleed that I've been experiencing. There are two big misconceptions I had regarding fabric bleed or color bleeding, color migration, whichever term you want to use to describe it. For years, until the past few years, I thought if you bought fabric from a quilt shop, it didn't bleed. Well, that is just simply not true. I only use quilt shop quality fabrics to make my quilts, and I have definitely had several that have bled. I've also recently experienced fabric bleed when I have been pre-starching my fabrics. Once the fabrics have been saturated and left there, I've been using white towels to lay them on. I've definitely experienced color bleed with pre-starching, and now I'm really careful to watch for that. In the past few months, I've been testing for color fastness on some of my fabrics. The second misconception that I had was that lower quality fabrics that you might get from big box stores, I thought that they were all prone to bleed, or the majority of them were prone to bleed. However, that's not true either. I specifically did a test of two different navy blue fabrics. They were from the same company. I purchased them at a big box store. One fabric, they were both navy blues. One fabric bled, the other fabric didn't. So that is definitely a misconception. So I've come to the conclusion that if a fiber, such as cotton that we use, has been dyed, then it is going to have the potential to bleed. So after some careful consideration of all the information I've gathered and my experiences, and watching and talking to quilters who have had quilt disasters or mishaps with color bleeding, this is what I've come up with, and this is what I do for my fabrics. I think it's a good idea to test your fabric for color fastness, because again, I think all fabrics have the potential to lose some of their dye. Maybe there's a little bit extra in there, maybe not. But I do definitely want to test that before I use the fabrics. I don't test whites and creams. And I really watch carefully for color bleed since I have started pre-starching fabric, and I've caught a lot of the color bleed during that process. If I haven't pre-starched the fabric and I'm going to use it, that does sometimes happen, and I'm concerned about a fabric, I will check, like for the backing of a quilt, I will check that fabric for color fastness. And this is how I do it. I take a bowl of hot water out of the tap and I put some of the fabric in there. Now here I'm going to show you a little video clip that shows how I do that. Here's an easy way to test for color fastness. These are just 2 white bowls, and I'm just putting water. This water was kind of hot, it's pretty, or warm, and I used white bowls so you could see as I test this to see what happens. So I'm just going to take this fabric. I chose a red. Oh, look at that. Immediately you see the fabric bleed. Whew. Now let's check this black and white fabric. This one just immediately started to bleed. And you can see this one. This one's starting to bleed too. So here I'm testing 2 solid fabrics. These are Quilt Shop quality fabrics, and you can see this blue has already started to bleed. Let's see what the orange does. And there you go, that one's gonna bleed too. Again, these are both Quilt Shop quality fabrics, and you can see that there's bleeding in both of these. When I did that color fastness test on those 4 fabrics this morning, I really thought I really did not anticipate all 4 fabrics bleeding. I thought there might be 1 or 2 that bled, and I was really surprised to see that all 4 bled. Now some people may say, well, if you put fabrics in hot water, they're all going to bleed. And that is simply not true either. I have tested many fabrics like that, and some have bled and some have not. So you can see the importance of testing for color fastness. Now, back to the temperature of the water. Let me give you another example. Here is a picture of a quilt that I made for one of my sisters. I used this turquoise fabric for the back. After I shipped it to her, for some reason I did a color fastness test on this fabric and it bled. This is a Quilt Shop quality fabric. It's one of the top brands, and it bled. So I called her and told her that when she got the quilt, whenever she washed it, she needed to be sure to use cold water and numerous color catchers when she washed it. And she did just as I said. She was worried about the quilt bleeding. She thought she might spill something on it, so she wanted to wash it and get that worry out of the way. So she washed it in cold water, and she put in 6 or 7 color catchers. After she had washed and dried it, she sent me a picture of the color catchers. Now here's the picture of those color catchers. And you can see the fabric definitely bled. And that was washed in cold water. Alright, so on with the process that I use. I do watch for color bleeding when I'm pre-starching my fabric, and I frequently do color fast tests on colors other than light background fabrics. Now, if I find a fabric that bleeds, when I first started doing this, I thought it would be a rarity. So the first one that bled was an old fabric, and I thought perhaps it was just old and the dyes got weakened, so I used that for dog beds. It was Quilt Shop quality fabric, and I'm not sure I did the right thing, but I noticed the bleed when I starched it, and it was touching several other fabrics, and it bled onto several different fabrics. So I got rid of that fabric. But then when I started doing the color fast test, or test for color fastness, and realized that lots of fabrics do that, I decided to use or check into the product called Retayne. And Retayne, it says stop the bleed. Now there's a specific procedure you follow on here, and that's what I did. As I was talking to another quilter, sometimes after she's done treated it once with Retayne, then she checks again for color fastness. Now I have not done that, and she said that she continues to do that 2 to 3 times. If after the 3rd time the fabric is still not color fast, then she does not use that fabric and she gets rid of that fabric. Now I've not done that. I've only used the Retayne one treatment. However, now I may choose to check the fabrics that I use with Retayne. Many quilters just pre-wash their fabric and then they think they're good to go. I don't think I'm going to pre-wash my fabrics because I do saturate them with the starch. Well, I did with the Stay Flow. I'm not sure what I'll do now since Stay Flow is no longer being manufactured. Well, even if I use the spray cans, I do fully saturate it, and I will continue to do that on white towels, and that will give me, I think, a good idea if the fabric's going to bleed. The color in the fabrics are going to bleed. If I'm really concerned, then I will do a color fast test on them, or test them for color fastness. In controversy that I hear a lot of quilters talk about that. A lot of quilters say, I'm not pre-starching I'm not going to pre-starch my fabric or pre-wash it because I like to use brand new, bright and crisp fabric. And I have to agree. I like that too. But here's the thing. Do you want to make a beautiful quilt and give it to somebody, and then once their quilt is soiled, they wash it and they have a quilt disaster? They're not going to know what to do. So is it better for us to treat the fabrics prior to gifting a quilt to help minimize the chances of that, so perhaps they'll be able to enjoy the quilt longer? In the comments below, you tell me which way you think is the best. Here's the process that I use when I wash a quilt or when I gift a quilt. This is how I tell those who I'm gifting it to take care of their quilt. First of all, I wash my quilt or quilts in cold water. I only wash one at a time. And I try to use a gentle soap. I use the new quilt soap put out by Quilters Rule. I did have some difficulty getting this. The lid leaked and made kind of a mess, but they did send me another one. There may be some other gentle soaps that you can use, perhaps some that aren't this expensive, but this is what I use to wash my quilts. So I wash it in cold water, and I use this soap. In the washer, I also put 5 to 7 color catchers. Now, some people may not think these help, but I do, because you can see in the previous pictures that I've shared with you, the color catchers do catch dye that gets loose and is in the water in the wash. And whatever dye these catch is dye that's not going to end up on my quilt. So I will continue to use these, and I will continue to instruct those who I gift a quilt to use these when they wash it. The next thing I am sure to do is when the spin cycle stops, I get the quilt out right away and start the drying process. Now, I dry my quilts in the dryer. Some people like to lay theirs out flat on the yard on a clean sheet, but I just put mine on a gentle cycle in the dryer on low heat. But I think it's super important not to let that quilt sit wet in the washer, because remember, one of the factors that can lead to fabric bleeding or color migration is to leave it exposed to excessive wetness or liquids. If I have a quilt disaster, this is what I do. I put the quilt in the tub as soon as I can. As soon as I discover the mishap, I put it in the bathtub and I put it full of water, just with a lot of Dawn dish soap. I mean a lot. At least, I don't know, at least a cup of Dawn dish soap, if not more. And I let it soak. Another important thing that you have to do is you have to make sure all the fabric of the quilt is submerged. The reason I'm telling you that is because I was cleaning an old quilt, an antique quilt, with Retro Clean. And I was following the instructions, but I allowed some of the fabric to float on top. And there was a fabric bleed. The only fabric that caught that color was fabric that was at the, above that water line. And I worked and worked and worked to get that out. I got a lot of it out. I didn't get all of it out. But I do think that's extremely important. When you're soaking a quilt, all of it has to be submerged. And it needs to stay submerged. So this process, you need to soak the quilt for a day or maybe even 2 days, however long it takes until you feel like you've gotten out and done everything you can to save the quilt. Now during this time, I will gently agitate the quilt in the water, and I will occasionally drain the water and rinse the quilt, and then refill the tub with more Dawn dish soap. And then again, I just continue to repeat that process until I think I've done everything I can do. Please know, I am not a textile expert. I am not an expert in color fastness. There may be other processes out there that work even better than this process. But I think it's important to keep in mind all those factors that we talked about that can influence color bleed, including those that occur at home. That's how I take care of my quilts. Again, like I've said, I'm not a quilt expert, but that has worked pretty well for me. In the comments below, please be sure to share any quilt mishaps you've had or experiences you've had with color bleed. Tell us the processes that worked for you and any additional information you have. If you have additional resources, please let me know, because I'm always interested, especially in scientific research type articles or articles written by textile departments of universities. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope you find it helpful, and until next time, have fun quilting.